Welcome back to English 250. Today's video is going to be on finding and evaluating evidence. Just a brief recap of what we did last class. We learned how to structure arguments at the macro level. So now you know a little more how you might want to pick your sources based on what role they may play in your paper structure. In today's class, we will recap everything's in arguments chapters 18 and 19 on how to choose and evaluate sources with contextual reasoning and explore the C.R.A.P test. Let's jump right into it. The main force of chapters 18 and 19 is that not every source will count as a good source for every situation. This requires a lot of contextual reasoning skills or being able to read the room. What counts as the best evidence changes depending on your argument, your audience, and your delivery. On page 439, there are some good questions that help you jump into deciding whether an evidence counts or not. What or who counts as authority, and how do you establish credibility? How do you establish your own credibility? Is personal evidence allowed? Are qualitative, quantitative, or theoretical arguments valued most highly? These are all questions you can ask of the specific genre you're writing in at the moment. In this class, as English 250, we value academic sources, but also we allow a lot of popular sources too. For instance, if you want to use Kid Cudi, Kid Cudi counts as a quality source because he was a popular musical artist at a certain time that received millions upon millions of listens throughout the world. Ultimately, you are responsible for the authority of your sources. Once you use a source, you have to stand by its credibility. The source becomes your credibility as an author. Where you search matters a lot with contextual reasoning and evidence-based arguments. Of course, we all want to start at the library, but the library is not our main option right now to find physical sources or archival resources. However, you can still go to the library's website. The nice thing about all the different articles and indexes and databases that you could go through, like JSTOR or EBSCO, World Search, and all that kind of stuff, is that our search bar automatically brings all of those different resources together at once. We are kind of spoiled by this, and this makes researching really, really easy. However, if you are stuck at home and aren't finding the sources that you want, or want some more approachable resources instead of like academic journals that are hard to get into, there are many different options that you have for this class that you can just know starting out you're going to find highly credible sources. The place most people want to begin is, of course, Google. However, you have to know how to filter through the Google search results that you get. You're going to get very popular sources and ones that a lot of people use, but does that mean that they're good? A nice website that I like to filter some of my searches through. So if I find an article, put the source into this website for media bias and fact checking. All of these links are in Canvas, but what I really like about the media bias fact check site is that you can find really quality sources. They filter them through political left, least biased, and political right. They also have pro-science or conspiracy and pseudoscience, questionable sources, satire, etc. and so forth. I like using the filtered search button because sometimes I don't even know what I want to look for, and maybe I just want a quality news source. So I can go down here and use the least biased function, have the factual reporting to be very high, and I'm in the States, so I will start there. How to read this? Over on the left column is the particular outlet, and then over on the right is how many people are using it. So the Center for Responsive Politics has 6 million different references. Excellent, love that. Congress.gov, obviously very useful resource. Lawfare blog, different things I've never even heard about, which may say something about my ignorance as a researcher. But if you also want to take a source and throw it into their search engine, you can see if they've done a report on it, and they've done hundreds, probably thousands of different fact checks. And I'll show you how I use that in a later part of the video. If you're looking for just a good, well-researched news outlet that has a lot of different topical resources, JSTOR Daily is a fantastic one, and I only recently discovered this. I've been having a lot of fun with it. So the homepage for JSTOR Daily is really topical at the moment, teaching pandemic syllabus, and they have some fun. When language goes viral, I read this one on how we name a different pandemic changes different elements of who gets ostracized or who gets blamed for different things. But say for this course, I want to look up something on happiness. And we can get a lot of interesting sources that might expand our repertoire of knowledge. I like this one by a linguist on how Carpe Diem got lost in translation. And just even here, you can see how some of it might relate to your class. Let's see if I can find that particular section here. Seizing the Day brings up images of people taking what they can get, people who can get things done, active, self-reliant, YOLO-infused instant gratification. And then, of course, this linguist is going to provide a more nuanced stance on that. The next source is by the Library of Congress called CQ Researcher. You have to log in with your Iowa State Net ID, which is usually a pretty good indicator that if the library is willing to pay for it, it's going to be a quality source. Over on the right, you can see that they have hot topics, but they also have a very thorough search bar that you can check out too. Just to give you a little sense of maybe even how overwhelming some of these articles are, these are extremely detailed articles written by really credible people and have a ton of different sources. And this is just one of their hot takes that only has 26 sources in it. The full versions of some of these articles on popular topics are really, really impressive and really detailed. But say I'm looking for something like utilitarianism. We can look at how that word has been used here. It doesn't look like they have a specific topic on utilitarianism, but you can find how people have used it. And now you have a good source on ethical dilemmas and how people might argue against pure utilitarianism. The next one that I think is really applicable for our class is Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I've mentioned this a few times, and I've been tempted to assign some readings from it. But if you are interested in a concept like hedonism, well, here you go. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is regularly updated, so first published in 2004, but then they did a substantive revision in 2013, and for philosophical topics that have lasted for 2,500 years, to have multiple updates on things as new evidence comes out is really impressive. The list of, they have multiple different lists of sources, so they have their bibliography, and they also have some related entries and other resources that you might want to check out. If you're interested in hedonism and just want to know where to begin, reading one of their overviews is fantastic. Sometimes they can be a little too academic and you might have to skim a little bit, but there you go. And of course, there's always knowing the differences between .com, .edu, .org, .gov websites and what they're meant for. .com is meant to sell you something. .edu is generally meant to educate you. However, if you're going to Iowa State's homepage, they're also selling you things. .org is an organization whose whole purpose is built around an idea. So even though they might be somewhat reliable, you have to also understand that they are banking on you agreeing with their ideas, and they have a bias. And .gov is also has its own problems, but mainly if you're going to like cdc.gov, that's going to be the most reliable source. And then you can also develop your own original data. We won't be doing that for this course, but sometimes asking somebody else about a topic or interviewing them can be a really fun way to introduce a topic. And just in general, every single source that you use should be interrogated. Do not only use sources that agree with you or confirm your opinion. For the documented essay, you have to come up with 4 different sides on a term. So forcing yourself to look at topics that disagree with the definitions that your initial sources have, that's going to be very important for your understanding of that term. Print sources and digital resources require different but overlapping fact-checking skills, and I think the books do a good job of covering that. But I thought there would be just a fun example of, every source should be interrogated. So on page 460 of Everything's an Argument, we have this quote by Ernest Hemingway. So we've got a nice little picture of him here, and it says, "Every man and woman should have a built-in automatic crap detector operating inside him." So Ernest Hemingway during a 1954 interview with Robert Manning. Okay. Before I published that online, I thought I should just see what the context of that quote was, because I thought it was a really good quote and might want to use it. But I found some kind of funny things when I looked it up. First off, the interview was published in the Atlantic in 1965, not 1954. Already, my automatic crap detector is ringing. So I was able to find the original Atlantic article in the archives with just a simple search of this quote. The second thing was Hemingway wasn't talking about source credibility. He was talking about what creative writers should ingest to become better, truer, more honest writers. So using a quote in as an example of what academic researchers should be doing in their fact-checking, that actually came from a fiction writer who was talking to other fiction writers, is, I think, interesting and a little dubious. The last element is you need to know how to ethically source and cite your stuff. Part of that is developing strong signal phrases, but this element of adding "and woman" here also gets my crap detector going. So virtue signaling to include "and woman" rewrites the complicated perspective of a man who may or may not have been generous and inclusive to women. People, in quotes, can be ambiguous, even wrong, and yet still also be quotable. A more ethical way to quote Hemingway here would be something like this. Hemingway once said in an interview with Atlantic writer Robert Manning that every man should have a built-in automatic crap detector operating inside him, including Sick, Hemingway, and Cuba. Well, his comments were for young writers learning how to invent fiction out of established scientific knowledge. Any writer, any person, relying on the words of others to create words for others, should indeed serve as an authorial bastion of truth. Again, this concept that we are responsible for our sources, and our sources reflect our credibility as speakers. This little Latin-based term, sick, just means what I have written is exactly how I found it in the original source. Yes, I am living in 2020, and we include women in the things that we do now. So we don't just use, we're not just talking to generic he or him. I get it. Hemingway wasn't there either. But what he's saying can go beyond that, but I can also reference that I get it. I know. He's just talking to other people, and I'll let the reader be grown-ups and decide for themselves how they want to take that. Okay. Get out of that. Moving out of everything's an argument, we need to get into this concept of, okay, what is maybe a heuristic or a tool that you can use to evaluate your own sources? This is where something that the speech comm department, as well as multiple different researchers from different institutions, have been putting together just an easy little phrase that we like to call the C.R.A.P test. So you've got Hemingway, you need to have a C.R.A.P detector, now you've got a C.R.A.P test. This is a way of doing contextual reasoning to establish the credibility of a source. So the 4 different letters stand for currency, reliability, authority, and purpose. And let's go through each one. Currency is simply asking the question of, when was the source published? Is your topic time sensitive? And this depends on what it is you're talking about. If you are talking about a philosophical concept, and Plato might be as relative or relevant now as he was back then, although there are important reasons to understand how time has changed. Similarly with religious texts, or even just human-based topics that seem to keep coming back up over and over again. Conversely, cutting-edge science relies on things that are as recent as possible. So if something maybe is even 2 years old, that could be outdated information. And this goes a little bit to the concept of like hot versus cold science. Is something being hotly contested right now, or is it pretty well settled? Are we able to go back to some of the foundational texts and say, yeah, they got that mostly right, and we agree with this. This is really good for like a historical understanding of a scientific concept. And some things, even if they're expired, still have value. You can set limitations on the relevance of your topic by how you frame it in your paper. So here's a little example. When you go to a website, always try to find how recently the website's been updated. Not all websites show this. However, the more credible the website, the more often that they will show their update history at the bottom of their page. The next element is the reliability of your source. First question here is it a primary or secondary source? And I thought it'd be worth just spending a little bit of time on primary versus secondary to help you understand what this means. So first, a primary source is just coming straight from a person and what they have to say, and not summarizing what somebody else has said. A primary source example would be this document from the White House. This is the State of the Union address. This is a straight transcript of what President Trump said. A secondary source is the Wall Street Journal covering that address. So Trump's State of the Union address live analysis. Somebody doing a fact check on it as they go. You can also look at Kid Cudi's The Pursuit of Happiness is a primary source. He was the one who created this song, and we can look to that source and analyze it on its own, but we can also look at secondary sources or people talking about that source. So here's a New York Times article talking about Kid Cudi's album that this song came from. Primary sources are really strong. It just means that you have to do more work to uncover the meaning of them. Sometimes it's really good to collect a whole slew of secondary sources to help you better understand a primary source, but ultimately the primary source is the thing that you want to do. In our class, we had a topic of Sam Harris on utilitarianism, and so there was the actual TED Talk that Sam Harris delivered, but then I also supplemented that with a secondary source that explained what Sam Harris was saying and comparing it to some other thinkers. The next step in reliability is asking the question of, does your source cite other credible sources? Can you verify the information for yourself? And has someone else verified the info? In academic publishing, these are so important of questions to ask that they created an entire concept called peer review. If you go into any library search through Iowa State, you'll see this little element down here that says peer reviewed. This just means that the journal it's published in has a process called academic peer review. Basically, an author will submit an article. The editor will initially determine whether they like the article or not, and then they will send that article out to experts in the field. These experts are blind reviewers, which means that they do not know who wrote the original article, and they also do not know who the other peer reviewers are. So they stand as this safeguard to make sure that whatever knowledge gets published in the academic journal at least maintains the standards of the field. Peer review is super important, and if your article is, or whatever source you're using, comes from a peer-reviewed source, it's going to be far more credible and reliable than if it didn't. However, humans are fallible, and there are open source communities that critique peer-reviewed journals all the time. So always question where your sources are coming from and never take anything for granted. So we have in our C.R.A.P test currency, reliability, and the next one is authority. Who is the author? This is super relevant for online sources because I don't know how many times I've been sitting in a writing center session and somebody asked me, how do I cite this source? And we go to the webpage and we cannot in any way find out who the author is. This is very common because many times a website will just say like, the website is the author, which is more or less true, but really credible sources will either take on the authority of the governing body. For instance, the CDC counts as that source's author, but sometimes it's hard to tell who's writing something. But then you can dive in. What are the credentials of your author? Are they well respected in their community? And this is where you can start to follow the citations a little bit. If you've never used Google Scholar, it's product provided by Google. You can go in and search for pretty much anything. So here's somebody I know in my field who is pretty important, and I can find one of their articles. Great. So here's a book that they have called Writing with Power. Actually, I have this one sitting on my shelf. But this book has been cited by 2,000 people within my field. My field's pretty small. That's pretty reliable. But then I can click on the source itself and start to check, okay, who else has been looking at this and what have they been saying about it? I can create a source mind map that has multiple different points of view on it. And, here's somebody just as recent as 2006 who has 22,000 sources that seem to find my original author relevant. That's great. But also never assume others know who you're talking about. So even if somebody is super famous in your field, and I can say the name Peter Elbow is famous in composition studies, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about who that person is. So never assume others know who you're talking about. Use a signal phrase to introduce them. I could say, composition scholar Peter Elbow, who invented the concept of process, or who is one of the leaders of process theory and composition in the 1970s, blah, 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 blah. Currency, liability, authority, and finally, purpose. Why was this source published? It's very difficult to ask these questions because sometimes it's hard to tell. But was the purpose of your source to inform you about something, to sell something, or to persuade you about something? This gets to the question of bias. Is the source objective? How can you tell? One question to ask in this is, who is funding the source? How is the author being compensated for their work? Who is the audience? Is this meant for a bunch of scientists and professional academic researchers? Is it meant for the general public? And then every other nuance in between there. And then finally, how do you intend to use the source? This was something that I found would have helped a little bit more in some of your topic selections, where I was seeing a lot of people do materialism and happiness and using sources that I didn't think had a purpose that related at all to how you were going to use it. The author's purpose was moving in one direction. However, you were, because you were familiar with it, taking that source and making it something it is not. So purpose is contextual, and whether something is relevant really depends not only just what their purpose was, but also how you intend on using it too. All right, so that covers the C.R.A.P test, but I think it would be best to show you how a C.R.A.P test functions, because you have an assignment in Canvas for C.R.A.P testing your source. So underneath week 10, for Wednesday, you have this posterior C.R.A.P test on your outside source. Get here. And it just asks you to take one outside source from your upcoming A5 assignment and run it through this C.R.A.P test. So first step, find an outside source, get outside the class materials, and then try to figure out whether it is credible or not. For one of my other classes, I was asked to read an article called Designing for Accessibility. Designing for Accessibility is not that hard. It was published on a Medium website, and I thought it would just be interesting to run through it because I had to read it. So let's see what this thing looks like. So it's published from uxdesign.cc, which is a different way that people use .com. It's not as common. Actually, it was really hard to figure out what CC meant, and I'm still not very confident what it means. Okay. Currency. This article was written in 2018. And currency in the field of accessibility. So this is how you design websites and apps to make them accessible for multiple different readers, not just people who, can see and hear things and use mouses, but also people who need, text to audio resources, or who have to navigate web pages using, maybe with only keyboards and can't use mouses, etc. and so forth. So currency in this field matters because technologies and how to best design for them change rapidly. Even though 2018 is only 2 years ago, I must read critically to ensure that all this info is still relevant to my work. So currency is really important. 2018 means that this is pretty credible, but I just have to be on top of my game to make sure that what they're writing is important. The reliability of this source we can look at from a variety of ways. It's a primary-ish source. So through here, we have an author who has multiple different tips on how to make websites usable. So add enough color contrast. Okay, great. We have a couple different sources going on through here, but this is the author's sort of advice, but then you also have these different little sources down at the bottom. So it's more of a synthesis of a lot of other people's advice. So it seems to rehash other sources of information for itself, does not clearly state what ideas are original, if anything, and we definitely know it has no original data. There is no experiment done to prove any of these how-to ideas. So the sources are highly credible, and I went through and I did a couple of those checks. They come from really, really impressive places. However, some are only how-to instead of peer-reviewed or experimental tests, meaning that these are best practices in the field, but the author is mainly citing just instructional sources on how to do the things. Now, another element of the reliability is that I am not a usability expert and I cannot verify these things for myself. However, 23,000 people liked this article, and of the 70 plus comments, many are favorable, but many more seem to come from experts who warn others that this article only begins to scratch the surface of accessibility compliance. If your source has a comments page, go and check it out. So I'm scrolling through my article, and down at the bottom, I see that there's a large discussion response, and I went through and saw that these people are responding. These are not just passive users, but experts in usability. Okay, so I think that it's pretty reliable, although I've got some doubts on a few different things. And this leads us to the question of authority. Who is this author, and why do they have the right to speak on this topic? So in the article, the author briefly mentions that he worked for a company doing this kind of work. Okay. He seems to work professionally as a web designer. Okay. Has 32,000 followers, whatever that means. I don't really know much about this type of site. However, several commenters pointed out that his use of animations was anti-accessibility. Okay, that's kind of an interesting point. Here you have in this article this sort of flashing thing. Because I'm not a usability or accessibility expert, I don't really know that that's a problem, but I do listen to people who make good arguments that it is. There is no formal peer review process for these articles, and the UX Collective, where this thing was published, seems credible to the community, or at least serves as a landing page for many experts to discuss their field. But it is not a peer review source. Now, how do I find that out? So first off, I can go to, if I want to learn more, Pablo Stanley has a little link here. It says 185 following, 32,000 followers. That's where I got that stuff from. I can find other stories by this author, and I guess there are other stories there. Great. Love that. But then I can go and do a little bit of research on this concept of the UX Collective itself. And I went into the how to publish for the UX Collective. And I read through their whole checklist, why they, you should publish through here, how to submit articles, and what will you edit before happening. And at no point did I see that there was a peer review process. So how do I submit my article? You email. They say that they'll let you know within 2 days whether they want it or not, which seems very kind. After being accepted and reviewed, your article is added to the queue to be published. Once your article is published, we ask you to keep it in our publication. So here's this critical moment where I cannot tell whether this is peer reviewed or not. This is very important for me to be skeptical of. So even though it is a very popular website, should I take it as the most authoritative thing or not? I have my doubts. So how else could I find more about this information? I know that this UX, this article is published underneath the umbrella of Medium. I don't know a whole lot about Medium, so I can read more about that. But I can also go back to my website of Media Bias Fact Check. I love this because now I can put in Medium and see what comes up. Okay, so we have a little bit of a left center bias, but then what really matters to me is that they are saying that it has a mixed credibility for its sourcing. I think this is very important. There's the very background of it says that basically they are a blog host that covers a bunch of different things. So depending on which blog you're looking at will have a variety of different sources. So this just tells me that it's really up to me to go in and fact check each one of the different elements. Now, ultimately, I think that this article that I found is pretty good so far, but we've got one last element to look at, and that's what is its purpose. Its purpose is to teach. And I think with the number of different credibility things that we know about it so far, its currency, reliability, and authority, having a little bit of leniency that it's meant to teach a couple different skills and it shows you how to do it, that is really important. It's not necessarily meant to create brand new knowledge that other people can build off of for the future, which is why it's not doing experiments and it's not publishing in a more rigorous publication. So the audience is other designers who may not have implemented these basic design tips. Therefore, the audience is not comprised of accessibility experts necessarily, but those who would benefit from their advice. Funding for Medium and UX Collective and for the author is unclear, vague at best. If you agree that accessibility matters, then you'll be more favorable to this website. So it really depends when and where you want to use this source to determine how credible it is. In the end, I have a more nuanced position on what I think about this website or this article. If I just want to dive in and find a couple quick tips to help out, great. But I also listen to the comments on the article that says that there are a ton of accessibility guidelines, and that if you were to only follow this article, you wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface of how much there is. Okay, that means I also have to do more homework too. All right, I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more about how to find and evaluate evidence. I like the C.R.A.P method as just a way of going through your sources and wrapping your head around what their strengths are and what their limitations are as well. So again, last class, we picked our sources, or we picked our topics and figured out some ways of doing argument structure. In today's class, we covered everything as an argument and the C.R.A.P test. And in your upcoming class, we will dive into a literature review. A literature review is an element commonly featured in academic writing that helps you understand the big picture conversation. You also begin reading your first source you want to annotate and strategically summarize it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. As always, I want to help you understand this class as easily as possible as we move online. So if you have any tips or tricks that you think would make this class move more smoothly, please let me know about those as well. All right, happy Wednesday.